Sue Leschen, and I am the director of a company, a very niche market company in the UK. The company is called Avocat, Legal and Business French, Interpreting and Translation. And I'm based in Manchester, UK, home of the most probably famous football club in the world, Manchester United, and for some of you, I suppose, Manchester City as well. And my background is that I studied languages at school, particularly French, Spanish, Latin, and English, and later on Welsh. And then I decided to qualify as a lawyer. So sort of forgot my languages for a little while, officially anyway, and concentrated on law, which is a really big, learning and reading subject, and became a UK qualified solicitor. And then after a few years went back really to my big passion, which is one of my big passions, which is languages, and then set up my company. Usually around interpreting and translation are my main topics of interest, and I'm talking obviously French interpreting and translation. I don't cover any other languages, although I've got a smattering of Spanish, a tiny bit of Italian, and my Welsh is pretty fluent because I used to live there. But these days I am purely concentrating on legal and business French interpreting and translation, which means that I'm working, before the pandemic anyway, face-to-face interpreting in legal settings, such as courts, police stations, the Home Office, immigration, law centres, those kind of venues. And then I'm carrying out translation work for those sort of venues. I get quite a lot of work for translation of witness statements and so on from lawyers. Funnily enough, I've just been contacted by somebody who wants an interpreter to interpret for her in an auction on Zoom. So that'll be a first. So that's that's a sort of rare form of business interpreting. But alongside the strictly legal interpreting, I pretty regularly interpret for businesses at meetings. I'm currently interpreting actually for some nuns, would you believe, who are selling a convent, and for quite a lot of money actually. And we have pretty much regular meetings with them, with the sisters, and also with their accountants and lawyers, at the moment obviously on Zoom. So yes, even though I'm just really concentrating on those two areas, law and business, with my French, they're very varied in terms of the kind of jobs that come into my inbox. They're not all bog standard, interpreting in the magistrate's court or just interpreting in a company AGM. Far from it. For me, the best aspect is, without a doubt, it's so interesting. I think it's really a platitude. It's quite a common saying for people who love their jobs, but every day is different. But it's always an interesting job, and I never clock watch. I have been an employee in the past, when I was employed full-time as a lawyer, and I certainly admit that sometimes when I was stuck in a litigation department, that wasn't always very proactive and so on. I was quite glad actually when 5 o'clock came, but now for me there just simply aren't enough hours in the day. I did study languages at school. I actually went to a school that was very pro teaching languages, which is quite interesting when you look at the current climate, where there is quite a down on language acquisition, which I find really sad and actually very short-sighted, because I think those of us with languages can go places that others can't. And at school, as I say, I studied English, French, Spanish, Latin, and I certainly advise anybody out there, any school children, not to hate Latin too much. It is quite difficult, but if you are looking at a career with what we call the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian and so on, Latin is very, very useful for background. And I also at one point went to live in North Wales, where I quickly realised that in order to work, by then I was qualified as a lawyer, by the way, I was targeting job adverts that were saying Welsh is desirable for this job. And I very soon realised actually it meant essential. You just weren't going to get the jobs if you couldn't speak Welsh. Quite rightly in many cases, because many of our clients, the elderly, just didn't have very good competence in English. We'd have clients coming in with statements written in Welsh and so on. Welsh is spoken in the courts there because of the Welsh Language Act and so on. So I had to learn Welsh, and I had to learn it fast, and I had to learn it really well. So that's what I picked up. And then I concentrated, as I say, for a few years on being a solicitor, and then eventually found myself in a local authority litigation department. And suddenly I started being approached with offers of contract, translating contracts that had been written in French and so on. I don't know how, but somebody found out that I spoke fluent French. I'd always kept my French up, and that's really where it took off. And so on top of getting qualifications at school, GCSEs and A levels in languages, and then getting my law degree, and then eventually my solicitor's qualification, and as I say, in later years my Welsh language qualifications. I got a GCSE and an A level in Welsh as well. I then topped all that up with what's called a diploma in public service interpreting. I studied for that at nights on top of my solicitor's job, which was a bit hairy actually. It was a very long process, a long day sometimes doing all that, but it really paid off. So I'm currently learning Breton because we go to Brittany a lot. It's very similar to Welsh, and so I'm just one of those people, I think, that pick languages up like blotting paper. And if I went on holiday to Japan or anywhere really, Kenya or wherever, I would make every effort to learn the language of the country that I'm in. There's a big misunderstanding out there about the value of languages, that the science, I suppose the STEM subjects we call them, are much more valuable, and that if you've got a STEM subject, science, technology and so on, you're going to get a better job. And actually it's those of us who've got languages who can access jobs that others can't. Some of my colleagues access work that, because they've got a language, they wouldn't have got otherwise, whether it's engineering or working in luxury fashion or working, I don't know, like myself in the legal field. We have the edge. I started at a very early age in primary school because my parents sent me to a primary school that again valued languages. I think I've been very incredibly lucky in that respect, actually, that all my education through from primary onwards has targeted languages. I'm not sure my parents sent me there for that reason, but that was what happened when I was there. So, I was learning French from a very early age, really, and I just obviously really enjoyed it and made a lot of effort and, added Spanish eventually and Latin and so on. My French is obviously native fluency because of my job, my Welsh is pretty native, but because I don't live in Wales anymore, it's I have lost quite a lot, unfortunately. That's where immersion comes in. Every time I go back, I pick it up again. I go back very regularly. Well, I would do if it wasn't for the pandemic. But my languages are at different levels. They're not all on the same plateau, if you like. But what do I like best? I think because certainly my French gives me a window into communities and different cultures from my own. I interpret quite a lot, for example, for French-speaking African asylum seekers in the immigration services and the Home Office and so on. And I have learned a lot about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, about Cameroon, Chad, and so on, that I just wouldn't have known otherwise. I've met these people from the other side of the world. I've been doing that for about 20 years now. So, I know a lot about their culture and, how very different it is from my own. And most people in the UK would just have no idea. I mean, why would they? They don't get that sort of access. It's like for most people, there's a curtain drawn across their vision of the world, and they only know about it through maybe what they see on TV, or they read in the Daily Express or the Sun newspaper, or maybe a bit more upmarket, the Guardian or the Times or whatever. But they have no real hands-on knowledge of these different cultures. They've never met anybody from these cultures. I go into houses in Manchester with social workers and lawyers and so on, and, sit down with people from another country and, listen to their experiences. And, I can remember once when I first started out as an interpreter, one of the clients was talking about how part of the journey to the UK involved riding a camel. And I thought I had misheard, and I thought he said something like he'd come along a channel or something. I thought maybe in a boat. And then I asked him to repeat, and he repeated he had crossed part of a desert on a camel to get here. So, this to us here in the West is just, well, we don't ride camels regularly, do we? It's just so alien to our experience, but for him it was part of their transport, their daily transport. I think it's made me aware, as I've mentioned, of different places, people, cultures, countries. It's given me an awareness that I wouldn't have had otherwise. It's expanded, it's widened my horizons. It takes me, even when I'm working here in the UK, it's taking me out of the UK, even now during lockdown. This evening, for example, I'm on a Zoom meeting with interpreter colleagues in Budapest in Hungary. We're planning a conference, an online conference. So I'm going to be talking to them about terms and conditions for remote interpreting. What do we need to tell clients about interpreting on Zoom and the various other platforms? So, it's changed my worldview, really. I think because the schools I went to were really pushing languages and they were considered to be very important, that gave me a very good grounding. The two schools I went to, the primary and the secondary school, didn't really target, for example, the STEM subjects, science and maths, which has left me not very good in those areas, but very good in the area of languages. But I think also if you've got some kind of natural tendency, competence for language learning, then that helps as well. And I honestly believe not everybody does. I think there's been a lot of research done on the different sides of the brain and so on. And some people are naturally more sort of technical, scientific, and some people are much better at languages and the arts and, you know, English and so on. So I think if you've got all the right things in place and they all sort of meet up, then you're on a winner, really. But I do feel sorry these days for children who are in schools, you know, who are, shall we say, pupils in schools that aren't valuing languages, because I think that, you know, those pupils are seriously disadvantaged for the future. You know, certainly if they wanted to travel and access jobs outside of the UK, for example, you know, it's not very beneficial to be in a school that doesn't value languages. But unfortunately, as we know, it's very common these days, and I'm very saddened when I see universities closing language departments, closing translation and interpreting departments. It's happened here in Manchester, in Salford University. They used to have a really good and vibrant and very well thought of translation and interpreting department that's now closed. You know, so if you are looking for a career in languages now, I think you're going to have to be much more proactive and fight for it and do a lot more research trying to find, you know, how to progress it than possibly people like me did, because, you know, a few years ago it was all there for you. You could just follow all the kind of milestones and pick up the qualifications and so on, but it's not so easy now. But I mean, I don't want to be dismissive and put people off. I think that, you know, there are still ways of obtaining qualifications. I mean, contact, for example, the Chartered Institute of Linguists. I sit on their governing body, and we have interpreting and translation exams. You can do them online these days. So, you know, you can get yourself qualified. Well, I suppose there were, in the sense that when I went to university, I initially went actually to do joint honours, law and French. And then when I got there, because I wanted even then, you know, to marry my twin passions, law and languages. But when I got there and I saw how the courses were laid out, law is an incredibly big reading subject. And I could see very, very quickly that no allowance was being made by either department for the other's coursework. And I just knew pretty quickly, within about the first month, I think, that one subject had to suffer at the expense of the other, simply because I don't think the course structure was very well thought out. And I then decided, well, I'm going to have to target, for me personally, I think it's best to target one subject and leave the other alone for a while and pick it up later. And I knew that I could always pick French up, you know, whenever I wanted, put it on hold sort of for 3 years, if you like. Obviously keep it up in my own time, but not study it full time in the same way I was studying law. So that's what I decided to do. I changed from joint honours, law and French, just to single honours, law. And for me at the time, it was the right decision. But, you know, with hindsight, I don't think I should have been put in that position. I should have been able to study both. And I know I wasn't the only one. But these days, that, you know, I think they've got it much more worked out. And you can do joint honours with languages, and you can do languages and business studies and this sort of thing. So, you know, I think there's more scope now. Immersion. You know, it's difficult at the moment, obviously, with the pandemic, but there are things you can do. You know, go online, there's lots of courses, join practice sessions where you can talk to speakers of the, you know, and I mean native speakers of those languages. You know, you can get channels on TV. I, for example, have TV5, which is the French news channel. which I listen to regularly. I think it costs us about £1 a month or something. It's very little. Even on Netflix, actually, these days, which I think costs about £6 a month, and half the population of the UK, I'm sure, has got Netflix during the pandemic, something to do. But I mean, there's loads and loads of foreign films on Netflix, even, with subtitles. And I watch a French detective series called Spiral. In French, it's called Engrenage. And, I've watched every single series, and my colleagues and I discuss it because the terminology is really useful for us who are working with the police and so on. So, there's lots of things like that you can do. And obviously when the travel restrictions lift, start traveling to your target countries and as much as you can. And, if you live in quite big towns like I do in Manchester, say your language is French or German, look out for organisations linked to those languages. For example, here in Manchester, we have the Alliance Française, which is a big cultural centre, and they have soirées, they have events that we can go and attend. They have French films, exhibitions, book clubs, cine clubs. And then for German, there's the Goethe Institute in Manchester, and I know that they exist in other big towns as well. So, it's not enough, I don't think, to just study from textbooks or online courses. I think you need to meet people too, and join these organisations for the kind of cultural and social, events. Because that's part and parcel of what languages are. It's not just terminology, and it's understanding a whole different worldview. There's always something more to learn. I mean, I was just on one of our e-networks this morning with some French colleagues, and we were discussing these COVID vaccinations you can get now when you go to various centres. You can drive past and you get injected you won't open the car window. And we were discussing the terminology for this because languages, I think we call it le drive-in, because languages are always evolving and we constantly have to keep updating ourselves, not just in my case the official language of the courts, but say an act of parliament changes. At the moment there's a domestic abuse bill going through the UK Parliament, so I have to brush up all that terminology, but equally so I need to know the language of the streets, the slang that people speak out there, because in my jobs I have to interpret not just for lawyers and judges and magistrates, but I have to interpret for defendants who live in quite rough areas, who will be speaking, shall we say, their version of the Queen's English, which is very different from that of the lawyers. So, I need to know what they're calling heroin, cocaine these days, cannabis. I need to know all the slang for that as well, because I need to interpret it. I might need to translate it in documents. And, if I don't understand what they're talking about, then I'm lost. I think if we, even though, the UK is now out of Brexit, out of Europe, thanks to Brexit, there's still a lot of work coming in from Europe. I mean, my colleagues and I were terrified by the thought of Brexit, and we were really worried that it would affect our job offers and so on. But I mean, I can't see that it has. We're still getting work, from agencies in France and so on. And my German colleagues are still getting work through from Berlin, or Spanish are still getting work in from, I don't know, Mallorca or Madrid or wherever they're getting work. I mean, some of the work is actually related to Brexit itself. The new regulations, have to be translated. So I think my final comment really for anybody thinking about learning languages is there's always work out there. You're always going to get work. You are never ever going to be in a situation like, unfortunately, some people are now because of lockdown, without any work at all and in danger of losing your job. There's always work for language professionals. There always will be.